Major Sarah Chen had always been told she was too small for the cockpit. At 5 feet 4 inches, she barely met the minimum height requirements for military aviation. Her drill instructors had laughed when she first applied for the A-10 Thunderbolt program. The massive aircraft, nicknamed the Warthog, was known for being one of the most challenging planes to fly. It was built like a tank with wings, designed to take punishment and keep flying. Most pilots who flew it were seasoned men with years of experience and the physical strength to handle its brutal controls. But Sarah had something that couldn't be measured in inches or pounds. She had determination that burned like jet fuel in her veins. Growing up in a small farming town in Nebraska, she had watched crop dusters skim just feet above the cornfields, their yellow planes dancing between power lines and silos with precision that seemed impossible. While other kids played with dolls or video games, Sarah built model airplanes and dreamed of touching the clouds. Her father, a mechanic who worked on farm equipment, had always encouraged her dreams even when others scoffed. He taught her that machines responded not just to force but to understanding. Every gear, every bolt, every wire had a purpose, and if you could feel that purpose, you could make any machine sing. Sarah carried that lesson with her through flight, school, through the countless hours of rejection and doubt, through the nights when she wondered if everyone else was right about her limitations. The A-10 was different from any aircraft she had ever encountered. It wasn't graceful like a fighter jet or smooth like a passenger plane. It was raw power wrapped in titanium and steel. The first time she climbed into the cockpit, the controls felt foreign under her small hands. The stick required more force than she was used to, and the pedals seemed positioned for someone with longer legs. But Sarah adapted as she always had. She adjusted her seat, modified her grip, and learned to use leverage instead of brute strength. During her training missions, Sarah discovered something remarkable. Her smaller frame, which everyone had seen as a disadvantage, actually allowed her to fit more comfortably in the tight cockpit during long missions. Her lighter weight meant the aircraft could carry more fuel or ammunition. Most importantly, her farming background had given her an intuitive understanding of ground terrain that many pilots lacked. She could read the landscape below like a map, spotting features and obstacles that others missed. Colonel Marcus Webb, her commanding officer, was initially skeptical. He had seen plenty of talented pilots wash out when they couldn't handle the physical demands of combat flying. The A-10 wasn't just about flying straight and level. It was about diving toward the ground at terrifying speeds, pulling out at the last second and doing it again and again while enemy fire lit up the sky around you. It was about flying so low that you could see the faces of people on the ground, close enough that a single mistake would mean certain death. Sarah's first real test came during a training exercise in the Nevada desert. The mission was simple in concept but brutal in execution. She had to provide close air support for ground troops who were pinned down in a narrow canyon. The target was a mock enemy position hidden among rocks and ridges, requiring precision that left no room for error. The traditional approach was to attack from medium altitude, using the aircraft's sophisticated targeting systems to identify and eliminate threats from a safe distance. But Sarah saw something different when she studied the terrain maps. The canyon walls created natural wind patterns that would affect her weapon's accuracy at higher altitudes. The mock enemy position was positioned in a way that made it nearly impossible to hit effectively without risking collateral damage to the friendly forces below. She spent hours studying the topography, calculating wind speeds and angles, and developing what her fellow pilots would later call an insane plan. She proposed flying lower than anyone had ever attempted in that type of terrain. Not just low by normal standards, but so close to the ground that her aircraft would be threading between canyon walls with mere feet to spare on either side. The altitude would be so minimal that traditional navigation instruments would be useless. She would have to rely entirely on visual flight, reading the landscape like her father had taught her to read the grain patterns in wheat fields. The other pilots in her squadron thought she had lost her mind. Flying that low in such confined terrain wasn't just dangerous, it was considered impossible. The margin for error was so small that even a momentary loss of concentration or a slight miscalculation would result in catastrophic impact with the canyon walls. The G-forces from the required maneuvers would push both pilot and aircraft to their absolute limits. Colonel Webb pulled Sarah aside after she presented her plan. He had seen bold pilots before, and he had seen reckless ones. The difference usually determined who came home and who didn't. He studied her face, looking for the telltale signs of overconfidence or desperation that often led to tragic mistakes. Instead, he saw something he hadn't expected, a calm certainty that came from deep understanding rather than blind courage. Sarah explained her reasoning with the precision of an engineer and the passion of someone who truly loved flying. She had calculated every angle, considered every variable, and prepared for every contingency she could imagine. She wasn't proposing this flight path because she wanted to show off or prove something to her doubters. She was proposing it because she genuinely believed it was the best way to complete the mission and protect the ground forces who would be depending on her. The night before the training exercise, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, visualizing every second of the planned flight path. She imagined the feeling of the stick in her hands, the sound of the engine, the way the canyon walls would blur past her cockpit windows. She thought about her father, working late in his shop, coaxing life from broken machines through patience and understanding. She thought about the crop dusters of her childhood, skimming impossibly close to the earth with graceful precision. Tomorrow, she would either prove that the impossible was simply another word for difficult, or she would join the long list of pilots who had pushed too far too fast. Either way, she would face the sky on her own terms, with skill earned through countless hours of practice and a heart that had never learned to accept defeat. The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of gold and crimson as Sarah performed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision. Every rivet, every panel, every control surface received her complete attention. The A-10 Thunderbolt sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its twin engines and distinctive straight wings giving it an appearance that was both menacing and oddly beautiful. Other pilots often joked that the A-10 was so ugly it was pretty, but Sarah saw elegance in its brutal efficiency. Her ground crew watched with a mixture of respect and concern as she completed her checks. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran mechanic with 23 years of service, had worked on hundreds of aircraft and thousands of missions. He had seen pilots come and go, watched careers soar and crash, and developed an instinct for reading the signs that separated the great ones from the cautious ones. As Sarah signed off on her maintenance log, he pulled her aside. Rodriguez spoke in the quiet, serious tone that experienced military personnel used when lives were on the line. He told Sarah that he had heard about her planned flight path through the squadron gossip network that moved faster than jet fuel through fuel lines. He wanted her to know that her aircraft was in perfect condition, every system tested and retested. But he also wanted her to remember that even perfect machines had limits, and those limits were usually discovered by pilots who pushed just a little too hard. Sarah thanked him for his concern and his meticulous work on her aircraft. She understood the weight of responsibility that came with her decision. It wasn't just her own life at stake, it was the reputation of her unit, the confidence of her fellow pilots, and the future opportunities for other women who might follow in her flight path. Every mission was a test, but this one felt different. This one would either open doors or close them, possibly forever. Colonel Webb assembled the training observers and safety personnel for a final briefing. The mock enemy position had been set up with sophisticated sensors that would accurately record the effectiveness of any attack runs. Multiple cameras positioned throughout the canyon would capture every moment of the exercise from different angles. Medical helicopters were stationed at strategic points along the flight path, ready to respond to any emergency. Webb had even arranged for an experienced rescue pilot to fly chase in a second A-10, maintaining altitude above the canyon to provide assistance if needed. The plan was ambitious beyond anything attempted in that training area. Sarah would approach the target canyon from the east, using a series of desert ridges to mask her approach from the simulated enemy radar systems. She would then drop to an altitude of less than 50 feet above the canyon floor, threading her way through the winding passage while maintaining enough speed to avoid becoming an easy target for ground-based weapons systems. The most challenging part of the mission would come at the target area itself. The mock enemy position was located in a widened section of the canyon, but it was still surrounded by rock walls that rose several hundred feet on all sides. To effectively engage the target, Sarah would need to execute a series of precise maneuvers that would bring her even closer to the ground, actually flying below the rim of the canyon while delivering her simulated weapons payload with surgical accuracy. As Sarah climbed into her cockpit, she felt the familiar embrace of the aircraft around her. The seat had been adjusted to accommodate her smaller frame, and every control fell easily under her hands and feet. She ran through her startup checklist with practiced efficiency, each switch and gauge confirming that her mechanical partner was ready for the challenge ahead. The twin General Electric engines spooled up with a reassuring roar that vibrated through the entire airframe. Tower control cleared her for takeoff, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of acceleration as the A-10 gathered speed down the runway. The moment of liftoff was always magical, the instant when tons of metal and machinery defied gravity through the marriage of power and aerodynamics. She climbed to her initial altitude and headed toward the training area, using the flight time to settle into the rhythm of the aircraft and fine-tune her mental preparation. The desert landscape below was deceptively peaceful. Rolling hills covered in scrub brush and dotted with Joshua trees stretched to the horizon in every direction. But Sarah knew that beneath this tranquil surface lay the complex terrain features that would either make her mission possible or impossible. She had studied satellite photos and topographic maps for weeks, memorizing every ridge and valley that would guide her approach to the target area. Her radio crackled with updates from the ground observers and the chase pilot. Weather conditions were optimal, with minimal wind and excellent visibility. The simulated enemy forces were in position and ready to begin the exercise. All safety personnel had reported ready status. Everything was as perfect as military precision could make it, but Sarah knew that perfection on the ground meant nothing once she committed to her low-altitude flight path. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah reached her initial approach point. She could see the target canyon in the distance, a dark slash across the desert floor that seemed impossibly narrow from her current altitude. She took a deep breath and began her descent, feeling the familiar sensation of the aircraft settling into its new flight profile. At this point, there was no turning back. She was committed to a flight path that would test every skill she had developed and every lesson she had learned. The radio fell silent as Sarah approached the critical phase of her mission. Ground observers tracked her progress on radar, but soon she would be too low for reliable radar contact. From that point forward, she would be flying into a zone where only her own eyes and instincts could guide her safely through the maze of stone and sky. The chase pilot maintained his higher altitude, ready to coordinate rescue efforts if the unthinkable happened, but unable to provide direct assistance during the most dangerous parts of the flight. As Sarah approached the canyon entrance, she could feel her heart rate increasing despite her years of training and preparation. This was the moment that would define not just this mission, but potentially her entire career. She thought briefly of all the people who had told her she was too small, too inexperienced, too ambitious for her own good. Then she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the immediate task ahead. The canyon walls rose up on either side of her aircraft as she committed to her low-altitude flight path. There was no room for hesitation now, no opportunity for second thoughts. She was flying faster and lower than anyone had ever attempted in this terrain, threading her way through a passage that seemed designed to test the very limits of what was possible in military aviation. The world transformed the moment Sarah dropped below the canyon rim. What had been open desert sky became a narrow corridor of stone that seemed to press in from all sides. The canyon walls rose like ancient sentinels, their weathered faces marked by millions of years of wind and water erosion. At her current altitude, flying at nearly 300 miles per hour, every rock formation and every curve in the passage demanded instant recognition and perfect response. Sarah's hands moved with fluid precision on the controls, making constant, tiny adjustments to keep her aircraft centered in the narrow passage. The margin for error had shrunk to mere feet on either side. A momentary lapse in concentration, a single incorrect input, or an unexpected gust of wind could send her crashing into the unforgiving stone walls. Yet she felt more alive and focused than she had ever felt in her life. The A-10 responded too, her touch like a well-trained horse responding to an experienced rider. Every input through the control stick was immediately translated into subtle changes in the aircraft's flight path. The twin engines behind her roared with steady power, their sound echoing off the canyon walls and creating an almost musical harmony that seemed to match the rhythm of her heartbeat. She could feel the aircraft's every vibration through her, hands and feet, reading its language like a conversation between old friends. Ground observers stationed at various points along the canyon tracked her progress with a mixture of amazement and terror. Through their binoculars and cameras, they watched as the massive A-10 navigated through passages that seemed impossibly narrow for such a large aircraft. Radio communications had become sporadic due to the terrain interference, leaving Sarah largely on her own to navigate by sight and instinct through the twisting corridor of stone. The chase pilot flying high above maintained radio contact with ground control, providing updates on Sarah's position when possible. From his altitude, he could see the entire canyon system laid out like a map, but he could also see just how narrow and treacherous the passage really was. He had flown combat missions over enemy territory, faced surface-to-air missiles and hostile fighters, but watching Sarah thread her way through that canyon made him more nervous than any combat situation he had ever encountered. Sarah approached, the first major challenge of her flight path, a sharp bend in the canyon that required a banking turn at an angle that would bring her wingtips dangerously close to the rock walls. She had calculated this maneuver dozens of times on paper and in her mind, but the reality of executing it at high speed in the confines of the canyon was entirely different from any simulation or planning exercise. She began the turn with smooth, gradual pressure on the controls, feeling the aircraft bank to the left as the canyon wall swept past her cockpit window close enough to touch. The G-forces pressed her into her seat as the A-10 carved through the turn, its massive frame somehow finding room to maneuver in a space that seemed designed for much smaller aircraft. For several heart-stopping seconds, the wingtip navigation, lights painted moving shadows on the canyon wall, so close that observers later swore they could see scorch marks on the stone. Emerging from the turn, Sarah found herself in a slightly wider section of the canyon, but her relief was short-lived. According to her mental map of the terrain, the most difficult part of the flight was still ahead. The canyon would narrow again and then split into two branches. She would need to choose the correct path while maintaining her speed and altitude, with no opportunity to circle back and correct a mistake. The split appeared ahead of her like a fork in a river of stone. The left branch curved away toward the target area, while the right branch led to a dead end that would require either a dangerous climbing turn to escape or a high-speed reversal that could easily result in collision with the canyon walls. Sarah had chosen the left branch during her mission planning, but seeing it from her current perspective made her understand just how challenging that choice would be. The entrance to the left branch was marked by two massive rock formations that created what pilots called a gate, a narrow opening that required precise navigation to pass through safely. Sarah approached the gate with her aircraft perfectly aligned, but the visual illusion created by the perspective and her high speed made it appear as though the opening was shrinking as she got closer. She fought the natural instinct to slow down or climb for safety. Her mission planning had shown that maintaining speed was crucial for the success of the entire exercise. If she slowed down too much, she would become vulnerable to the simulated ground-based weapon systems that were part of the training scenario. If she climbed too early, she would lose the element of surprise that made her unconventional approach tactically valuable. The gate flashed past her cockpit in a blur of stone and shadow. For a fraction of a second, Sarah felt as though she was flying through a tunnel carved from solid rock, with her wingtips barely clearing the obstacles on either side. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating, like threading a needle while riding a rocket. Beyond the gate, the canyon opened into a wider area that provided temporary relief from the claustrophobic confines of the narrow passage. Sarah used this breathing room to check her instruments and confirm her position relative to the target area. Everything was proceeding according to plan, but she knew that the most challenging part of the mission was still ahead. The target area lay in a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by high canyon walls. To effectively engage the simulated enemy, position She would need to drop even lower, actually flying below the level of the surrounding terrain while delivering her weapon's payload. The maneuver would require split-second timing and perfect execution, with no room for hesitation or correction. Sarah could see the target area ahead, marked by the smoke and flags that represented the enemy position. Ground observers and cameras were positioned to record every detail of her attack run. The success or failure of her entire mission would be determined in the next few minutes, during a sequence of maneuvers that pushed both pilot and aircraft beyond the normal limits of safe flight operations. She began her final descent toward the target area, feeling the familiar sensation of controlled falling that marked the beginning of an attack run. The canyon walls rose higher on either side, as she dropped lower, until she was flying in what amounted to a deep trench carved from the desert floor. The sound of her engines echoed and re-echoed off the stone surfaces, creating a thunderous roar that announced her approach to everyone within miles. This was the moment that would prove whether the impossible was just another word for untested, or whether some boundaries were meant to remain uncrossed. Sarah prepared to find out which category her mission would fall into. Time seemed to slow as Sarah approached the target area. Every second stretched into an eternity of split-second decisions and razor-sharp focus. The bowl-shaped depression that contained the simulated enemy position opened before her like an amphitheater carved from living rock. The walls rose steeply on all sides, creating what military strategists called a hard target environment, a location where traditional attack methods would be ineffective or impossible. Sarah's aircraft was now flying so low that her landing gear would have scraped the canyon floor if it had been extended. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced in her flying career. It wasn't just low-altitude flying. It was flying in a three-dimensional maze where every surface represented potential disaster. The walls of the canyon rose above her cockpit, creating the strange visual effect of flying underground while still being airborne. Ground observers positioned around the rim of the canyon watched in stunned silence as the A-10 materialized in their field of view like a metallic thunder god emerging from the earth itself. The sound of her engines, amplified and distorted by the canyon acoustics, created a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the surrounding rock formations. Several observers later reported that the experience was so intense it felt more like a natural disaster than a military exercise. The target itself was positioned in the center of the depression, surrounded by realistic mock-ups of enemy equipment and defensive positions. Sophisticated sensors would measure the accuracy of Sarah's simulated weapons delivery, while high-speed cameras captured every moment for later analysis. The success criteria for the mission were precise. She would need to place her simulated ordnance within a circle no larger than 50 feet in diameter, while flying at an altitude and speed that made such precision theoretically impossible. Sarah began her attack run with the calm focus of a surgeon performing delicate surgery. Every control input was deliberate and precise, calculated to compensate for the unique aerodynamic effects created by flying so close to the canyon walls. The rock surfaces created turbulent air currents that buffeted her aircraft unpredictably, requiring constant corrections to maintain her intended flight path. Her weapons targeting system, designed for use at much higher altitudes, struggled to lock onto the target in the confined space of the canyon bowl. Sarah had anticipated this problem during her mission planning and had trained extensively to deliver accurate fire using visual targeting techniques that most modern pilots considered obsolete. She was flying her multi-million-dollar aircraft, like a World War II fighter pilot, relying on instinct and experience rather than sophisticated electronics. The target rushed toward her at incredible speed, growing from a distant speck to a clearly defined objective in a matter of seconds. Sarah's finger hovered over the weapons release button as she made final adjustments to her aircraft's position. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and her simulated ordnance would fall short. Too late, and it would overshoot the target area entirely. At the precise moment when her training and calculations indicated optimal weapons release, Sarah pressed the button. The A-10 shuddered slightly as the simulated weapons separated from the aircraft, their ballistic trajectory carrying them toward the target below. But Sarah's mission was far from over. She now faced the equally challenging task of escaping from the canyon bowl without colliding with its walls. The exit strategy she had planned was as audacious as the approach had been. Rather than attempting a climbing turn that would expose her to simulated enemy fire from the canyon rim, Sarah intended to continue her low-altitude flight through a narrow exit passage that led out the opposite side of the bowl. This passage was even narrower than the route she had used for her approach, requiring maneuvers that pushed her aircraft to its absolute performance limits. Sarah pulled back on the control stick, initiating a climbing turn that would thread her aircraft between rock formations that seemed impossibly close together. The G-forces generated by the maneuver pressed her deep into her ejection seat, while the canyon walls blurred past her cockpit windows in a kaleidoscope of stone and shadow. For several terrifying seconds, it appeared to ground observers that the A-10 was going to impact the canyon wall, but Sarah's precise control inputs guided the aircraft safely through the narrow opening. Emerging from the exit passage, Sarah found herself back in open desert airspace, but her mission was not yet complete. She needed to climb to a safe altitude and navigate back to the airfield, while her aircraft's systems recorded the results of her weapons delivery. The transition from the claustrophobic confines of the canyon to the open sky was jarring, like emerging from a cave into brilliant sunlight. Radio communications crackled back to life as Sarah climbed away from the terrain that had been interfering with her transmissions. Ground control immediately requested her status, their voices betraying the tension they had felt while she was out of communication in the canyon. Sarah reported that she was airborne and safe, all aircraft systems normal, mission objectives achieved. The chase pilot, who had been circling high above the target area throughout the exercise, finally found his voice after several minutes of stunned silence. He radioed that he had never seen anything like Sarah's performance, and that the attack run would be talked about for years to come. His professional aviator's assessment was that the mission had been executed flawlessly, with a level of precision and skill that redefined what was considered possible in military aviation. Ground observers began reporting their preliminary assessments of the weapon's delivery accuracy. The early indications were that Sarah's simulated ordnance had impacted within the designated target area with unprecedented precision. Not only had she accomplished the impossible feat of flying through the canyon at ultra-low altitude, but she had also achieved the mission objectives with a level of accuracy that exceeded the performance standards for conventional high-altitude attacks. Colonel Webb, monitoring the exercise from the command center, felt a mixture of relief and professional pride as he watched Sarah's aircraft appear on radar, climbing steadily toward the airfield. He had authorized a mission that many of his peers considered recklessly dangerous, betting his own reputation on a young pilot's conviction that the impossible was simply another challenge waiting to be overcome. Early indications suggested that his faith had been justified. Sarah leveled off at a comfortable cruising altitude and set course for home base, but her mind was already analyzing every aspect of the flight she had just completed. She reviewed each maneuver, each decision, each moment when success and disaster had been separated by mere inches and split seconds. The flight had proven that her unconventional approach was not just possible, but potentially superior to traditional attack methods for certain types of targets. As the familiar outline of the airfield appeared on the horizon, Sarah reflected on the significance of what had just occurred. She had not just completed a successful training mission, she had demonstrated that the boundaries of possibility in military aviation were far more flexible than most people believed. Her success would open new tactical possibilities for future missions and prove that innovation and determination could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The landing was smooth, almost anticlimactic after the intensity of what Sarah had just accomplished. As her A-10 touched down on the familiar runway, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The aircraft rolled to a stop with its usual mechanical precision, but Sarah remained in the cockpit for several extra moments, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had successfully completed a mission that military aviation experts had declared impossible, flying lower and with greater precision than anyone had ever achieved in similar terrain. Ground crew members rushed to secure her aircraft, but their usual efficient professionalism was tempered by obvious excitement. Word of her unprecedented low-altitude canyon flight had already spread through the base communication networks, faster than her aircraft had traveled through the stone corridors. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez was among the first to reach her aircraft, his weathered face showing a mixture of relief and professional admiration as he began his post-flight inspection. Colonel Webb arrived at the flight line within minutes of Sarah's landing, accompanied by several senior officers who had monitored the exercise from the command center. Their faces reflected the same combination of disbelief and respect that was becoming the standard reaction to Sarah's achievement. The preliminary data from ground observers and tracking systems indicated that not only had she survived the impossible flight path, but she had also delivered her simulated weapons with accuracy that exceeded all established performance standards. The debriefing session that followed was unlike any that Sarah had ever experienced. Instead of the usual routine analysis of flight parameters and mission objectives, she found herself explaining techniques and decision-making processes that had never been formally documented or taught. Her fellow pilots listened with the focused attention usually reserved for combat veterans sharing hard-won battlefield wisdom. Sarah described how she had used visual reference points carved into the canyon walls to maintain precise navigation while flying too low for reliable instrument readings. She explained her method for compensating for the unpredictable air currents created by the confined space, and how she had modified traditional weapons delivery techniques to account for the unique geometric challenges presented by the target environment. Each aspect of her mission had required innovation and adaptation beyond the scope of conventional pilot training. The video footage captured by ground cameras was analyzed frame by frame, revealing details that even the most experienced observers had missed during the real-time execution of the flight. The images showed Sarah's A-10 threading between rock formations with clearances measured in feet, rather than the dozens or hundreds of feet that marked normal safety margins. In several shots, the aircraft appeared to be flying through spaces that seemed physically too small to accommodate its wingspan. Word of Sarah's achievement spread beyond the immediate training base within hours. Military aviation communities around the world began discussing the tactical implications of her successful, ultra-low altitude canyon navigation. Fighter pilot forums buzzed with analysis and speculation about how her techniques might be adapted for other aircraft and mission profiles. Aviation magazines and military journals started requesting interviews and technical articles about the mission. But the most significant impact of Sarah's flight was felt by the other women in military aviation. Her success shattered assumptions about physical limitations and demonstrated that innovation and skill could overcome traditional barriers. Female pilots who had been told they were too small, too weak, or too inexperienced for certain assignments suddenly found themselves being reconsidered for positions that had previously been closed to them. Sarah received messages of congratulations from pilots around the world, including several from legendary aviators whose names were synonymous with pushing the boundaries of flight. Each message carried the same underlying theme, that her achievement represented more than just a successful training mission. It represented a fundamental expansion of what was considered possible in military aviation. The technical analysis of her flight data revealed innovations that had never been formally documented. Sarah had intuitively developed techniques for reading air currents and terrain features that could potentially revolutionize low-altitude flight training. Her methods for maintaining aircraft control in confined spaces represented advances that could benefit not just military pilots, but also civilian aviators flying in challenging environments like mountain rescues or firefighting operations. Colonel Tew. Webb found himself fielding calls from senior commanders throughout the military aviation hierarchy. Sarah's mission had attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership, with implications that extended far beyond a single training exercise. Her success had proven that unconventional thinking and meticulous preparation could overcome challenges that had been considered insurmountable using traditional approaches. The formal mission report that Sarah submitted became required reading for advanced pilot training programs. Her detailed analysis of decision-making processes, risk assessment techniques, and innovative flight procedures provided a blueprint for future pilots who might face similar challenges. The document was classified and distributed through official channels, but its influence spread throughout the military aviation community like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Sarah's squadron mates began looking at their own mission assignments with fresh eyes, wondering what other impossible challenges might yield to innovative approaches and determined execution. The psychological barrier that had once defined the limits of possibility had been permanently shattered. If Sarah could thread an A-10 through canyon passages that seemed too narrow for any aircraft, what other boundaries might be waiting to be crossed? The transformation in Sarah's status within the military aviation community was immediate and profound. She went from being the small woman who barely met minimum requirements to being the pilot who had redefined what those requirements actually meant. Her name began appearing on lists for advanced training programs and special assignments that had previously been closed to pilots with her level of experience. More importantly, Sarah's achievement had implications that extended beyond her individual career. Military planners began incorporating her techniques into tactical doctrines for operations in confined terrain. Her success had created new possibilities for missions in urban environments, mountainous regions, and other challenging landscapes, where traditional aviation approaches were ineffective. The impossible had become possible, and the reverberations from that transformation would continue to influence military aviation for decades to come. Sarah had not just completed a difficult training mission, she had fundamentally changed the way an entire profession thought about the boundaries between possible and impossible. 6 months after her legendary canyon flight, Major Sarah Chen found herself standing before a room full of military aviation's brightest minds at the prestigious Air Force Weapons School. The auditorium was packed with pilots, engineers, and tactical experts who had come to hear firsthand about the mission that had revolutionized low-altitude flight doctrine. Her presentation, titled Redefining Operational Limitations Through Innovative Flight Techniques, had become the most requested briefing in modern military aviation history. Sarah looked out at the audience and saw faces that reflected the same skepticism she had once faced, now replaced by genuine curiosity and professional respect. Among the attendees were several of the pilots who had initially dismissed her canyon flight plan as suicidal. They sat in the front rows, taking detailed notes as she explained the technical aspects of flying in terrain that conventional wisdom had declared off-limits to aircraft. The success of her training mission had led to her selection for a real-world combat deployment where her unique skills could be put to practical use. The mission briefing she had received was classified at the highest levels, but it involved providing close air support for special operations forces operating in mountainous terrain where traditional air support was ineffective. Sarah would be flying in conditions that made her training canyon look spacious by comparison. Her deployment had been a complete success. Flying through mountain valleys barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan, Sarah had provided precision fire support that allowed ground forces to complete objectives that had been considered impossible without massive collateral damage. Her ability to place ordnance with surgical accuracy while flying in impossibly confined spaces had saved countless lives and completed mission objectives that conventional aircraft could never have achieved. The military honors and recognition that followed were unprecedented for a pilot of her experience level. Sarah received the Distinguished Flying Cross for her combat missions, making her one of the youngest female pilots ever to receive the decoration. More significantly, she was promoted ahead of schedule and selected for advanced command training that would eventually lead to her own squadron leadership position. But Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from the letters she received from young women around the world who had heard about her achievements. Teenage girls who had been told they were too small to pursue aviation careers wrote to thank her for proving that determination could overcome physical limitations. Female pilots in training programs cited her example when facing instructors who doubted their capabilities. Her story had become a beacon of possibility for anyone who had ever been told their dreams were too big for their circumstances. The technical innovations that Sarah had developed during her canyon flight were now being incorporated into pilot training programs worldwide. Flight schools began teaching her methods for reading terrain and air currents in confined spaces. Her techniques for visual navigation in GPS-denied environments became standard curriculum for special operations pilots. The Chen method of Ultra-low-altitude flight was studied and refined by aviation experts who recognized its revolutionary potential. Sarah's former squadron had been redesignated as a specialized unit focused on operations in challenging terrain environments. Pilots from around the world competed for assignment to the unit, knowing that training under Sarah's guidance would provide them with skills that no other program could offer. The waiting list for the program stretched for years, with experienced combat pilots willing to start over as students to learn her innovative techniques. The A-10 aircraft that Sarah had flown during her historic canyon mission was retired from active service and placed on permanent display at the National Air and Space Museum. A plaque next to the aircraft described her achievement and its impact on military aviation doctrine. Visitors to the museum often stopped to read about the small woman from Nebraska, who had proven that the impossible was just another word for untested. Colonel Webb, now promoted to general, often reflected on the decision to authorize Sarah's unprecedented training mission. His willingness to support unconventional thinking had not only advanced military capabilities, but it also opened doors for countless other pilots who might otherwise have been overlooked. He frequently used Sarah's story as an example when discussing the importance of recognizing potential in unexpected places. The broader impact of Sarah's achievement extended far beyond military aviation. Her story became a case study in business schools about innovation and challenging conventional wisdom. Engineers in various industries began applying her problem-solving approaches to their own technical challenges. The phrase, pulling a chen, entered professional vocabulary as shorthand for accomplishing something that experts had declared impossible. Sarah's parents attended the ceremony, where she received her promotion to lieutenant colonel. Her father, still wearing his work clothes from the farm equipment shop, stood with tears in his eyes as his daughter received recognition from the highest levels of military leadership. He remembered the little girl who had watched crop dusters skim across Nebraska wheat fields and dreamed of touching the clouds. She had not just touched them, she had redefined what was possible in the sky. The crop dusters that had inspired Sarah's childhood dreams now seemed quaint compared to what she had accomplished. But she never forgot the lesson they had taught her about precision flying in challenging conditions. Those yellow planes dancing between power lines and silos had planted the seeds of innovation that eventually flowered into techniques that revolutionized military aviation. As Sarah concluded her presentation at the weapons school, she looked out at the audience and saw the future of military aviation. Young pilots with dreams as big as her own, ready to push boundaries that their predecessors had considered absolute. She reminded them that every limitation was an opportunity for innovation. Every impossible challenge was simply waiting for someone with the right combination of skill, determination, and willingness to think differently. The standing ovation that followed her presentation lasted for several minutes, but for Sarah, the real measure of success would come years later, when the pilots in that audience would face their own impossible challenges and remember that a small woman from Nebraska had once proven that the sky had no limits for those brave enough to test them. Her legacy was written not in record books or awards displays, but in the expanded possibilities that every pilot who came after her would inherit. She had not just completed an impossible mission, she had made the impossible routine, opening new chapters in the endless story of human flight that would inspire generations of aviators yet to come.